After the tragic loss of his best friend, recovering addict Will begins a relationship with his former best friend's mother Claire, while trying to maintain his current relationship. In the opening scene, we're taken to an addiction intervention, where a young girl shares her experience. She expresses her fear of relapsing, but knows that she doesn't want to lose anything in life. In the end, she expresses gratitude towards her family and the people in the meeting, before Will takes a chance to share his story. Introducing himself, he assures everyone that he's doing fine, and claims that it's because he's met someone. Not only has he been clean, he has become serious, and wants to form a family with a new girl he's with. Lowering his head, he admits to being afraid to live with her. Knowing that he only shows a fraction of himself not to scare her off, he worries that she might run away after seeing the real him. After the meeting, Will drives back home. As he parks his truck, a man comes out of his car and calls out to him. Turning around, Will is surprised to see his old friend Chris. They share a hug and get inside to catch up. Chris is a struggling addict as well, they all are. But Will is the only one that's managed to stay clean for a while. He doesn't forget to congratulate him, but Will lets him know that it's because of him that he's clean. They move on to the balcony for a smoke when Chris decides to open up. He doesn't think that there's a way for them to live a normal life, but Will assures him that he's a great example. Seeing how well his friend's doing plays tricks on his mind, so he's not sure whether he wants to be alive. Instead of helping him, Will tells him that he doesn't have the answer, nor know how to help him. Desperately, Chris tries to continue the conversation to get some kind of push from his best friend not to give up. Unfortunately, Will asks him indirectly to leave because he has a girl coming over. Disappointed, Chris decides not to bother him anymore. Will's girlfriend Becca meets them at the front porch, but when she asks about Chris, Will lets her know that he's not important. Returning home, Chris gets scolded by his mother for taking her car without permission. He apologizes for wanting to be alone, but she has to check his eyes. After seeing that he's not on any, she lets him go to his room. Sitting on his bed with the needle in his mouth, Chris contemplates whether it'll be worth it to end it all. Unfortunately, the dark thoughts defeat him, and he decides to rake his own by overdosing. Having a mother's instinct, Claire decides to check up on him. Coming to his door, she tries to get in, but realizes that it's locked. She apologizes for her behavior, assuring him that she understands his situation, despite seeming like she doesn't. Wishing him good night, she can't seem to bring herself to bed as a bad feeling washes over her. Knocking on his door once again, she asks him to open up, but no sounds can be heard on the other side. Eventually, her knocks turn into bangs, but it's all useless as we see Chris lying lifeless on his bed. In the morning, Claire decides to call Will, but he can't be bothered to answer, as he's having fun with his girlfriend. However, once he reaches out, he is shocked to find out that his best friend, whom he saw the previous night, is deceased. Despite not being with Chris's father, Claire decides to tell him personally. Her heart breaks when he asks whether it's an accident, because she doesn't want to believe that he has taken his own. Given that the funeral will be the following day, Becca buys some clothing so Will won't show up dressed inappropriately. She suggests coming with him, but he lets her know that it'll be best if he goes alone. Arriving at the house, he scans the crowd before seeing his friend Preston smoking on the balcony. Coming up to him, Preston is surprised to see him, given that he hasn't seen him in a long time. Preston reveals that Chris hadn't stopped talking about him and their former band, and it makes Will smile. Same as Chris, Preston compliments his sobriety. Will thanks him for the kind words and asks whether he's clean. Shaking his head, Preston claims that he's not as strong as him, but Will assures him that he's nothing special. Getting up with Preston, he goes to Chris's room looking for Claire. Breathing in his clothes, she begins to sob quietly when a knock startles her. Will comes in and gives her a comforting hug, so they sit down for a talk. Will is looking healthy and Claire couldn't be more proud, which is why she wishes Chris had been there to see him. A clump forms in his throat and his stomach drops, as he knows that he could have been nicer to Chris the previous night. Not able to shake the guilt off, he decides to visit his father, whom he isn't close with. Even his father is surprised to hear that Chris is gone, because he had seen him the previous night. Assuming that Chris had been looking for Will to buy some, he asks to pull up his sleeves so he can check his wrists. Shaking his head, Will assures him that he's clean, but his father insists on taking a look. Back at the apartment, Becca can't help but wonder what his father's like. Joking about him being mysterious, she makes him laugh. However, he admits to hoping that she never meets him, because his father blames him for his mother's passing. Regardless, Becca assures him that she doesn't need to meet him because it'll be just the two of them. In the morning, Claire decides to change Chris's old sheets and clean up his room when she comes across his old band's album. Assuming that Will would love to have it, she gives him a call, and they settle on meeting at a restaurant in the evening. At dinner, she asks him not to talk about her, but to reveal more about his life. Will talks about his girlfriend and how she's sweet and understanding because he knows that it's hard to be with someone like him. Claire asks him not to say that because he managed to stop using, something that's not easy to do, something that Chris couldn't do. She still wishes that Chris and he had stayed friends, assuming that he might have taken the right path. Beginning to blame herself, she claims that she enabled him and that she set him back after every mistake. Curious, she asks Will whether he thinks it was an accident. Despite knowing the exact answer, he claims that he doesn't know. Disturbed, she begins to cry as she realizes that she will never get the answer to that question. Quickly, she runs to the bathroom to freshen up. As they leave the restaurant, Claire remembers the album, so she reaches into her purse and hands it to him. Will is surprised, and even though he doesn't want to remember the past, he still thanks her for it. Claire decides to leave, but Will notices that she is slouchy and appears to be exhausted, so he offers to give her a ride. She rejects it at first, but he asks her nicely, so she allows him to drive her. Throughout the ride, he notices that she keeps looking at him, almost as if she wants to tell him something. When they return to her house, she asks for a glass of water. Before he can hand her the glass, she runs into her room and collapses on the bed. Following her into the room, he hands her the glass, but once he tries to leave, she begs him to stay until she falls asleep. Pulling him towards her, she turns her back to him so he can spoon her. Caressing his hand, she pulls him closer and the tension grows. Soon, they face each other and begin making out. However, as they start to undress, realization hits Will, and he decides to break it off and leave. Instead of begging him to stay, she understands and lets him go. Lighting up a cigarette, Will runs to his car, but for the whole ride, he can't stop thinking about what he has done. The following morning, Claire decides to go back to work, and her co-worker is surprised to see her there. Given that she's just lost her son, her co-worker asks whether she needs someone to talk to. Assuming that she's trying to be friendly, Claire assures her that she will give her a call. However, the woman says that her therapist would be great for her, as someone who knows what to say. Skeptic of the therapy culture, Claire doesn't seem fond of the idea, but the co-worker assures her that it won't be a bad thing. Evening comes, but Will can't stop thinking about Claire, despite being in bed with his girlfriend. Unable to resist it, he decides to get up and lie to Becca about going to a meeting, despite her begging him to talk to her. She scolds him for trusting strangers more than her, but he lets her know that she wouldn't understand it. Shortly, he arrives at Claire's to surprise her. Letting him in, she asks what's wrong, and he reveals not wanting to be alone, but also not wanting to be around other people. Interested, she tilts her head and asks why he came to her, and he can't resist but kiss her passionately. Unlike the last time, they undress each other and let the passion take over. Sitting on the couch together, Claire decides to open up about her loneliness, regret, and wish to go back in time and fix everything. Remembering his mother's passing, she asks how he went through it. Turning to face her, he reveals that his mother was very sick, so it was only a matter of time before her passing. The worst is his addiction. Looking down at his hands, he admits to stealing medication from his mother just to fulfill his addiction. Thinking she was asleep, he admits to stealing from her one time, only to turn around and see her staring back. Heartbroken, Claire asks whether he apologized, but he reveals that he wasn't around her at the very end. Feeling his pain, she hugs him tightly. In bed, she begins blaming herself for Chris and claims that she could have prevented him that night. Will knows that it's partially his fault, but he tries his best not to reveal that he had seen Chris that night. Instead, he assures her that it's not her fault, giving her a sense of comfort. They end up falling asleep, and as Will wakes up in the morning, he follows the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen. Wishing him a good morning, she hands him a cup of coffee before serving breakfast. Taking his hand, she caresses it gently and asks him to come over in the evening. He promises to come, however, as he arrives back home, he blocks her number. The guilt grows in him, so he decides to make things right with Becca. Waiting for her after work, he opens up to her once she finishes her shift, admitting that he would collapse if it wasn't for her. He knows that it's unfair to put such a responsibility onto her, but wants her to know the full truth. Understanding him completely, she apologizes for asking him not to go to his meetings, because she knows that they're sacred to him. At the florist market, we see Claire with Will's father. While he had come to buy some flowers, he lets her know that he mostly came to check on her. That being said, He also tells her that he'll always be there if she needs someone to talk to. Feeling the rush of sadness over her, she asks him to change the subject, so he switches the conversation to the flowers. In the evening, as Claire waits for Will, she grows worried, so she decides to give him a call, asking him to let her know that he's fine. She hangs up the call abruptly before saying what she truly feels. Over at Will's, we see him with Becca. She ends up finding the album Claire gave him, so she takes the liberty to play it, despite Will asking her not to. The first begins, and Will's eyes drop as the music takes him back to the good old days before they were addicted. Unable to bear it, he shoots up from the couch and shuts the music off. Confused by his actions, she assumes that he's acting weird because he's blaming himself for Chris's loss. He tells her that she doesn't know what she's talking about, so she asks him to enlighten her. Instead of opening up, he stays silent, so she decides to leave. Lighting up a cigarette, he stays put as he watches his girlfriend leave, hurt by his actions. Eventually, he opens up about Chris at one of the meetings. Surprisingly, he admits that Chris started using because of him back in their band days. However, what he can't forgive himself for is turning his back on Chris when he needed him the most. Not wanting to help him, despite being the reason he was an addict. Even though he blocked Claire's number, after the meeting, Will pulls up to her driveway. Seeing his car from the window, she doesn't wait for him to get out, but decides to drag him out of the car herself. As they sit down, Will apologizes for Chris, but she assures him that he has nothing to feel sorry about. She doesn't know the truth, and it's eating him alive. Before he reveals more, he gets up and leaves her house quickly. His uncertainty seems to be taking a toll on Claire, as we see her becoming frustrated, and she notices two girls talking and looking her way. Deciding to confront them, she hurries to where they're standing and asks if they're talking about her. The girls turn out to be Chris's friends, so Claire asks them to remember him as a kind, gentle soul. Walking away, she opts for a smoke, and her coworker comes to check up on her. However, instead of listening and talking to her, she asks her to take her appointment with a therapist. Claire asks her not to speak nonsense, but the friend begs her to do it, because she knows that she helped her the most in her lowest times. Despite being skeptical, Claire goes to the therapist after work. Before revealing anything, Claire asks what her colleague has said about her. After finding out that the therapist doesn't know anything about her situation, she decides to pretend her son is alive. From the age to their love status, Claire describes the life of Will through Chris, talking about him like he's alive. Unable to resist it, Will ends up playing the album. But as the music goes, the memories come back, and so does the need to feel something. Helpless, he tries to get some from his friend, who unfortunately gives him some. Sitting in his living room, Will contemplates whether he should take them or not when he decides to call her. Over at Claire's, we see that she's not feeling well either. However, a knock on her door snaps her out of her thoughts. Opening the door, she's surprised to see Will's father at her doorstep. And when it comes to Will, we see him opening his door to let Becca in. Claire welcomes him and opens up to him as they sit down. She's finally accepted that she's alone and lonely. Curious, he asks whether she has ever remarried, but she reveals that she's only dated. Asking him the same question, she is pleasantly surprised to hear that he still sleeps on his side of the bed, as if she's alive. At Will's, he finally admits to being scared to reveal his true self, because he thinks that she won't accept him. All he needs is her, and luckily she's willing to stand by his side. Pulling him in for a hug, she assures him that she will never judge him or leave him because of his addiction. Things take a turn as we see Phil and Claire dancing in the middle of the living room. Feeling romantic, Claire leans in for a kiss that soon turns into a makeout. However, he pulls away, claiming that he's not ready to have anything with her. He sits on the couch, and she follows, assuring him that he shouldn't feel guilty. However, his response makes him question a lot of things. Phil claims not to feel guilty, because he knows Will is. In his eyes, if Will hadn't started using, everything could have been different, and their families wouldn't have been ruined. Claire reminds him that they're addicts, and that they're sick. However, Phil's convinced that everything could have been different if it wasn't for Will. Assuming that she knows, he mentions the night of Chris's overdose, alluding that it could have been avoided if he hadn't visited Will. Confused, she asks him to explain, and Phil tells her that Chris visited Will beforehand, feeling betrayed both by Will and her son Chris. Tears start to form in her eyes as she asks Phil to leave. In the morning, Becca wakes up to the smell of cigarettes as Will lights one in bed. Disgusted, she puts out his cigarette and asks him to stop it. He lets her know that if she wants them to live together, she'll have to get used to some things. A smile grows on her face as she asks whether he's suggesting they move together. He becomes shy, but reveals that he's been thinking about asking her to move in. However, Becca assures him that if he wants them to live together, he'll have to make some changes around the house. Their morning romance turns into a makeout. However, they're interrupted as a loud knock echoes through the house. Annoyed, Will goes to open the door, only to see Claire standing there. She lets herself in, and Will becomes terrified as Becca joins them as well. Sitting down, Claire asks Becca whether she'd ever felt like she couldn't be alone. Becca nods her head, but Will asks Claire whether she's been drinking, trying to make her sound like she doesn't know what she's talking about. Becca offers her a glass of water, but Claire asks her to sit next to her. Pulling the hair out of Becca's face, Claire decides to introduce herself. She lets her know that she's not Will's mother, although she sometimes feels like she is. What shocks Becca, however, is when Claire reveals that she never turns him away, even when he shows up at her door late in the evening. Regardless, Claire lets her know that he's not her son and that he'll never be Chris. Feeling sorry for her, Becca apologizes, but Claire gets up. She goes on about how life is unfair for giving Will a beautiful house, a girlfriend, and a steady job. It could have been Chris, but she claims that Will took all of that away from him. Will asks her to leave quietly, but she demands him not to be in denial. He doesn't take her comment lightly. He lets her know that she's in denial because Chris passed away in a room next to her. Flabbergasted, she doesn't say anything, but turns around and leaves. Disgusted and shocked by his actions, Becca heads to the other room to pack, but as she tries to leave, he begs her to stay. Becca asks for the reason, and he claims that he needs her, but it's too late for that, so she wastes no time getting out of that house. Getting into his car, Will drive straight to Claire's to finally let her know why he turned Chris down that day. All he wanted was another chance to live normally, away from the past. Not saying anything, Claire walks to Chris's room, and he follows. Looking at the bed, she says that she found him there with his eyes open. What pains her the most is that he was alone that night. She asks why he visited him that night, and Will claims that he wanted something he didn't have. Demanding to know, she is disappointed to find out that all Chris had wanted was to be his friend again, but Will couldn't give him that. However, he got to say goodbye, and Claire didn't. Her whimpers can be heard as she claims to be stuck without a goodbye from her only child, asking Will to feel her pain. She leaves the room, and tears start forming in Will's eyes as he sits on the bed. Coming to his senses, he decides to leave. But before he does, he assures Claire that Chris didn't want the life she had planned for him. Some people can't be saved, and Chris had been one of them. Driving back home, Will thinks about his life and the daily struggles he has with his addiction. Arriving home, he heads to his room to sit on his bed. After thinking for a while, he decides that he's had enough. Putting the syringe in his mouth, he ties his wrist so the veins pop out. Puts it up into his veins and slowly feels his body. Laying down, he finally lets go, having the same faith as his best friend.